Good Monday morning, and thanks for listening to my musing today about holiness. I don't think that word plays very well. That I can't think about holiness without thinking about holier than thou. Or, personal confession, I think about putting on my alb, that white robe that I preach in with the stole and the rope belt. Those have fancier, holier names. They're a little bit of a pain sometimes, occasionally, to some ministers. So when I think of holiness, I don't automatically associate it with what is good. And I think that that is a challenge to us. That there is a way of understanding holiness as presented in parts of the Bible that might be helpful for understanding the ways that we are called to live our lives. I want to give two examples. There's something in the Bible called the Nazarite Vow. In Scripture, we only read that 2 people in all of the Bible take the Nazarite Vow. It's presented in Numbers 6, and it says things like, you are not to cut your hair, you're not to drink the fruit of the vine, and you're not to touch a dead body. And the only 2 people that we read who take this vow, what we might understand as a short, temporary, festival sort of vow, we only read that 2 people take it, Samson and Samuel. And that's where our challenge begins. As we look through Scripture, and as we think about how we might be a holy people, a people set apart, what does it mean for these 2 people who take a lifelong vow for something that is supposed to be temporary? Is holiness something that we are supposed to achieve over a lifetime's worth of work? And wouldn't it be nice if everyone lived holy lives from birth to death? Or is holiness something that we do for a season? Something set apart from what is normal to teach us a little bit about what life could be like. So that there's not a lifelong expectation that we are always holy or that we are holier than other people. It simply says that for a time and for certain ways that we live, we know that we do things differently. In some sense, for the sake of being different. So the question is, what does it mean for us to be a holy people? Where holiness isn't a stick that we beat other people up with, but it's a way of introspection. That we have periods in our lives, maybe like the period where we are distanced now, where we say we are reconsidering our habits, our ways of being, so that whenever that period is done with, when we have a vaccine, when we're together again, we can remember parts of life that we said are valuable, that need to carry on with us. What does it mean to be connected even when distant? What does it mean for us to be at home, and what our houses and places of residence might mean for us, and the time we're supposed to take there? How do we understand parentheses in our lives, where things are moving along like usual, but we need little breaks, Sabbaths, holy periods, to reconsider who we are and who we want to be? That's what I've been thinking about this week. But I have so much more to say. When was the last time you thought about the Amish people as holy people? People who challenge everything about our ways of life as you sit there listening on your iPhone, iPad, television, computer. So if you're interested in those sorts of things, won't you listen a little more? There are sections in the Bible that not everyone is super familiar with. Judges and 1 Samuel might be some of those sections for you. They are for me. Numbers, I almost guarantee. I mean, a book like Numbers, it's like reading the phone book, right? But in Numbers, we get the notion of the Nazarite Vow. A small period where people abstain from drinking, abstain from dead bodies. Imagine it like a week's worth of Sundays, or Lent, or something like that. It is a small period for people to examine themselves. But in Judges and 1 Samuel, we see two lives that go counter to that idea of holiness. You probably know the story of Samson and Delilah. You know, the really strong guy who had wonderful flowing locks, but whenever those were cut, he lost all of his strength. An angel of the Lord said that Samson was to be a Nazarite for life, that from cradle to grave, he was supposed to exhibit a separate, different sort of life. And it literally made him stronger than everyone else, until he broke his vow, until his hair was shorn by Delilah, where he lost all of his strength. But we know that Samson was not an excellent example of holiness, that he did touch a dead body, that he killed a whole bunch of people with the jawbone of a donkey. He broke his vow there. We also know that he understands his secret not to be his connection with God, but long flowing locks. So in that way, holiness was something that he accomplished for himself, rather than recognizing it was his connection to God that made him strong. And there lies one of the challenges that holiness presents us with today, maybe every day. When we decide to do things that set us apart, the definition of holy, from other people, from other ways of life, it's easy to think because of our willpower, because of our choices, we are holier, better, than other people. Because we, are vegan, because we vote a certain way, because we don't use plastic straws, because we only eat local and organic, and that makes us better. There are good reasons for doing those things. But there's also a reason why talking about all of your CrossFit and all of your dieting makes you sound holier than thou. Holiness is not supposed to be, as I understand it, something that makes us better than other people or different than other people. It's simply an example to ourselves about how we exhibit self-control and how we are introspective about different ways of life that continue to be connected to God. So that during Lent, if you were to give something up, every time you want a piece of chocolate, or every time you're passing by a really good-looking steak, you give yourself a reason to remember what God has sacrificed for us. That these are moments of introspection for us to consider ourselves, not for us to beat down on other people. Another way of saying this is that holiness is not an ethic for all people in all times and in all places. And recognizing that there exist holiness codes, for me, has been really, really helpful. What do I mean by that? Some would suggest that the entire book of Leviticus, I know you've read it recently, is a specific rule for what it means to be a Levite priest, someone who works in the temple. So that those rules and laws primarily apply to people who are set apart, to make them distinctive so that others can consider what's important about life. It doesn't mean that eating shellfish is morally abhorrent. It just means it's an arbitrary difference to help us to be introspective about what we eat. I say we like I don't eat crab. That's a lie. What are the ways that we choose to be holy, to set ourselves apart, to live differently, even if only for a short period, so that we think about God and our connection to God? I think there are a lot of modern holiness movements. And by modern, I don't necessarily mean today. The Amish are an excellent example to us about what it means to live a life that's clearly set apart. I mean, seriously, how evil are buttons? If you don't know, Amish generally don't wear buttons because they're too snooty. They wear clasps. In everything they do, they try to live a simpler life. And in the words of Wendell Berry, the Amish might be the only people on the planet who've mastered technology. People who exhibit in their day-to-day lives the benefits of some technology, but they don't need it. They don't want it. I mean, how obligated do you feel to work via Zoom and your computer? Is it something that enriches your life or something that takes hold of it? Thankfully, because some people have chosen a path of holiness that is different from ours, not necessarily better than ours, they become a witness to us, an example to us of all of the ways that we are free to live life connected to God. If the Amish represent a step too far, because I'm not willing to give up my air conditioning, how do we start to understand something closer to home? And what I mean is, how do we, not in a holier-than-thou way, start to understand how we take up holiness practices for ourselves, for the best reasons, so that we're introspective, so that we feel connected to God, and in some ways, we provide an example to those around us about resetting our priorities. I think there's a scale from the Amish to us. Pentecostals, for example, early on in their history, maybe we think especially with women, had a fairly strict holiness code. That they weren't to wear pants, that they wore skirts. They weren't to wear makeup. And they didn't cut their hair, not unlike the Nazarites. In these things, the value that was exhibited was what? Modesty, humility, simplicity. And here's our challenge when we look at people who are different than we are. Do we see these exhibitions of holiness as draconian, as too harsh? Shouldn't we be able to wear whatever we want? Shouldn't we be able to exhibit and express ourselves in whatever way we feel called to do so? And that's where realizing that holiness can be temporary is really, I think, a wonderful opportunity for us. Because it's not the case when we wear whatever we want, that we are free. For example, do you think I like wearing wingtips to church every Sunday? No. Why do I do it? Societal expectation. No one's really asking me to wear wingtips, but if I choose to do it because I think it's nice to do, it still means that I am not expressing the most simple form of life, and I'm not living completely free. That there are social expectations that we feel, even if they're not explicit, about the ways we move about in the world. Which is why holiness can be freeing, not draconian. Because if I want to say that for an hour a day a week a year, that I want to be completely free of my cell phone, people might see value in those periods of holiness. Times when we imagine what life might be like if we were not beholden to every societal expectation, whether explicit or implicit. That's what the Nazarite Vow offers, yet we have these examples of a life committed to those sorts of things. How are we supposed to take that in stride? Is vegetarianism a modern-day holiness that is not only modern? Monks often were vegetarian except for holidays and times when they might be sick, according to the Benedictine order or rule of life. How do we take something like vegetarianism and say, by being vegetarian for a day a week, Meatless Monday, or a week a month a year, can I examine the ways that I eat, my health, my diet, and hit a reset button on my habits that might be good, might be bad, might be neutral, but that I have the opportunity through periods of holiness to say, I want to reconsider certain parts of my life. I think that's the opportunity afforded to us by some of the parts of Scripture that we find utterly strange. There are social expectations. There are things that set people apart. That's why we have Orthodox Judaism in the first place. Is there anything moral about avoiding pork? Lots of people try to find reasons. Today, really hard to do. Are there reasons for avoiding shellfish altogether? Not really. It's just something that's distinctive. Presbyterians are distinctive. I've already talked about my alb. We could talk about the Geneva black robe that people wear often in Presbyterian pulpits. Is it better than the Wesleyan robe? Yes, because Presbyterians are better than Methodists. Don't forget. Kidding. Why do we make ourselves distinctive in those certain ways? Because there are certain aspects of our practices that we do try to lift up. Simplicity, tradition, history, and generally being set apart. Recognizing that in our community, let's say the Presbyterian community, we focus more than others on God's activity rather than our own. Not because our theology is better, not because we're holier than thou, Methodists, but because that's something that we carry with us as distinctive, that makes us who we are. As long as we don't wield that sort of holiness as a holier than thou practice, then I think we might be doing a service, not just for us, but for the world, to say that there are lots of ways to live a good life. There are lots of areas in our lives, in our food, in our dress, in our quietude, in our prayer, where we carry on something that other people simply don't have the time or energy to think about. How wonderful that you might be a witness to the whole world about a life well lived, a life that no one else is living exactly the way that you are. And if you are the only person in your office who is positive, if you're the only person who commits to ways of simplicity, get rid of those buttons, then maybe that is a witness for others, an opportunity for others to know that a life by love and a life by grace is possible, even if buttons or latches aren't the clearest example of ways of love and grace. Holiness is strange. Two sets of pots and pans for Orthodox Jews. The ways we eat, vegetarian, vegan, omnivore, carnivore. What do these have to do with God? It might be a strange connection, but these are opportunities for us that in the daily parts of our living, we find ways to remind ourselves that God does call us to an abundant life, a life led by the Spirit that's fruit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And man, do I need reminders of that. For you this week, can you set aside some time when you wake up, before you go to bed, to focus on parts of your life that are restorative for you, that cause introspection for you? It doesn't have to be joining the Amish, but in morning walks, morning routines, the way you eat, can you find holiness in simple things? Maybe in looking for holiness, you find God, and maybe in looking for God, you find acceptance for who you are and who you are becoming. That's my personal hope for me. I hope you might find that too. So the ways that you can muse about holiness in your life, not as a stick to wield over others, but as a way for you looking at the life that God calls you to, I hope you do find something that is set apart, something that's special, ways that you realize that you are special to God and to your community. That's what I'm musing about. I hope you muse about it too, and I will give you some time to think about it. While you do, I'll see you next Monday. See you then.